Welcome to Inside the Cohort, a podcast specifically dedicated to the class of 2027 executive MBAs at Columbia Business School. I'm your host, Mitchell Black, and I am thrilled for today's episode. We haven't had somebody on the podcast that is so dedicated to climate science and everything climate related. Published author, can't wait to read both your books. I'm really excited about it. But we have Maria Dombrov on the podcast today. How are you?
Hi, Mitchell. I'm doing really well. Thank you. And thanks for starting off by highlighting some of my books. You already read my bio, so thanks.
Well, I remember being in class, and it was in our strategy class, and my ears perked up, and because you were getting pretty passionate about some climate science,
Yes.
and I was like, okay, she knows her stuff. What's up? And then you and I started talking. You had this book. You're like, oh, you should definitely read it. I'm like, that's great. Who's the author? Oh, it's you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned strategy because that was our first residence week, right? So it was like we just started getting to know each other. We were getting used to being at the IBM facility, attending classes like all day, every day. And we had this case reading on Zara, is Zara sustainable or not, in our strategy class. And I had a really honest opinion about the Zara take. And I think there's definitely more that fast fashion in general can do to be more sustainable. But I think also it's kind of like a civil duty of many people, many companies to kind of take climate into their portfolio. So I think me as a climate scientist, author coming into the program, I definitely had to speak my mind early on. And I think hopefully, I mean, I felt very welcomed by our cluster as a whole. Wanting to learn more about climate, asking me, first sidebar is saying, how can I, incorporate climate into my work? So I'm hoping that through this podcast, through like our interactions, and through my, continued sharing knowledge in class and in happy hour and various other settings, that people can learn more about environmental science, climate change, and incorporate it into their business.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And there's a bunch of wonderful things about your story that I want to unpack. But since we're already on the topic, I try to be the dumbest person in the room and ask the most
Hmm.
basic questions. And starting at Columbia, the two things that I felt like were just the tip of the iceberg from an outsider's perspective and then come into Columbia was anything climate and AI. Like
Yeah.
just me as a little dude from Georgia, you think you read some stuff, and then you show up at Columbia and you're like, holy cow, they know so much. Could you explain the whole methodology and thought process and your perspective around climate?
Sure, sure. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, yes, I think very early on, Dean Costas, I think it was in our orientation, said to us, there's two main things that you guys should be aware of when while you're enrolled in this program and how we're really integrating two topics, into the curriculum. And that was AI one, or, prioritization of AI because it is, it's so ingrained in our daily lives now. And then there's two, second one was climate. So I feel like AI is that hot topic technological, thing of the moment. And then climate is also popping up into, various curriculums. So for example, in our accounting class, Professor Ziv had a climate core slide where he basically said, it's important to actually invest in climate aligned companies because it will, there are return on investments there. So climate actually is, I firmly believe that climate is the past, present, and future, but really, it's our present moment. So I think integrating climate into business is extraordinarily relevant, especially when we think about risk reduction strategies as a whole. So for example, a company's physical infrastructure, how does climate come into play? So, one example that I have worked on in depth is lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy, which happened on October 29th, 2012. And as a result of Hurricane Sandy, it was this kind of like superstorm where a cold front met a tropical cyclone, and then as it came up the east coast of the U.S., it was kind of this superstorm that led to drastic amounts of flooding, storm surge, heavy winds, and it was very devastating for many places, including the city of New York. And I think it was really a moment where New York said, whoa, what are these types of events? How can we learn from them? And how do we incorporate climate into how we do both policy and business? And after Sandy happened, the whole financial district was basically in the dark for several days. So the physical infrastructure component was definitely at play. One of the city's primary concerns after Sandy was getting the financial district back up and running. And I think because of the integration of private sector, public sector cooperation, that's how really the city was able to recover so quickly, especially southern Manhattan. And I think, like this risk reduction component is somewhat underrated. But I think as time moves forward, we're going to have to be able to say what disasters, what natural hazards can we anticipate, and how do we prepare and adapt for them before they even happen? And this is a term that I like to call resilience. And I think as a person, you can be an individual resilient person, but also there's structures and systems that we can build out together to make more robust and become stronger for devastating storms before they happen. In my work a lot, we talk about how with climate change, and this is complicated, so I'm definitely happy to answer any questions that you have on it. But with climate change, there's increased heat, and with the increased heat brings a variety of cascading impacts. For example, with hurricanes, they're becoming more frequent and more intense when they do occur. So they're becoming bigger and more extreme. And this is the case for a variety of other events like flooding events, heat extreme events. And so there's a variety of issues that kind of come out of this increase in temperature. And we're already starting to see them.
You had mentioned risk reduction. What do
Yeah.
you mean by that?
So it's basically the capacity. I mean, it's an intuitive definition. So risk reduction is basically one person or a group of people or even a private sector business, their capability to understand a hazard, so a natural event, and be able to say, well, here's how I can incorporate these types of events, these type of climate weather events into my planning or into my structure of how I do business. And to be able to say that when something, if something were to occur, to be able to reduce or lessen the impact of a potential hazard. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. So, do you work with these businesses to help them with either their risk reduction or maybe how much heat they're putting out there to limit or help mitigate the chance that, hurricanes that severe happen, as an example?
I work with cities, so I
Cities,
do
whole
more
cities.
on I do more on the policy component.
Oh,
So I'm less involved in private sector businesses, but I would love to be more involved in the future, and that's something that I'm hoping to get out of this program, really the capacity to further understand, how the private sector works, how they can benefit and I can benefit, mutually from including climate into multi beneficial things. But I work with cities, so I work on kind of like the public sector side, but also the very researchy side. So to share a little bit more about my background and what I do now, I'm a senior research associate at Columbia University, the climate school within the Center of Climate Systems Research. And then I also have a contract with NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And in this work, I oversee a network of 2,000 scientists, economists, practitioners, and scholars, and even some city decision makers. And together we create assessment reports on climate change in cities. So, really distilling what is the latest research knowledge on a particular topic and what are the policy recommendations, what are the actual political implications of this work, and trying to say, here's the raw data, here's what this means. And here's how cities can take up the work and kind of like run with it. And so each city is different, but we do see some similarities between them. And so I work with I have 15 regional hubs around the world, and I run the secretariat in New York. But I have very close relationships with, for example, the city of Rio. We also have hubs in Kano, Nigeria. We have one in Durban, South Africa, Naples, Italy, Paris, France, Ahmedabad, India, and so the Shanghai, China, and so like the list really goes
Wow.
on. But it really is a vast, well-connected network that I am happy to serve as global coordinator of. So I kind of like, have my hands in the weeds and of all these different cities, trying to say, well, what is this local issue? How do we find solutions, and who do we work with on the ground that can really enable long-term action?
That is why. Okay, I didn't know that you had a global footprint, but that intuitively makes sense because I feel like it would be hard to solve a problem like climate looking at, just Austin, Texas. So you have to see how
Sure.
the whole thing works. Now, I might be reaching too far here, but it sounds like you'd mentioned you deal on the public sector, but you want to understand the private sector a little bit more. I would imagine that the public sector, if you can set these laws, would help govern how the businesses
Hmm.
operate. But you might be getting a lot of pushback and lobbying from the businesses because they don't want to change for their economic benefit. But are you thinking that you want to learn more about the private sector so that the job is just easier and it meshes together? Or am I thinking of something too far-fetched?
No, I think everything is interconnected, right? And so to really get to the heart of issues and to really, I mean, and quote unquote, solve climate change or find ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, like when you think of climate, there's two main points: climate mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is what we've talked about in our macroeconomics courses recently. But then also there's this world which I've kind of been alluding to on the adaptation side. So saying like, how do we understand all of this and prepare for the future coastal storms like and reduce our risk? And so I think that like everything's interconnected, and then the only way to really mesh the mitigation, mesh the adaptation, mesh the policy and the private. It's I think kind of important to learn like a lateral approach to all of it. And so I think through business school, I'm saying, well, what is the economic benefits to climate? Like how do we not only say reduce our risk, but also say something like, what's the economic benefit in, reducing your emissions, or, buying into carbon offsets, or choosing to, have your physical infrastructure in one location versus the other. And so my positioning at the business school is to say, well, like, how does this all work together? Where can we find solutions that benefit everyone? I believe in kind of utilitarian approaches. So how does this work for everyone, including the most vulnerable communities?
Have you always been interested in this space, or did you kind of fall into it?
It's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both. So my dad, very young, I was always out gardening. So I mentioned, I live in Westchester, New York. And so I'm in the suburbs of Manhattan. And my dad and I, we grew up planting seeds, like planting radishes, planting cucumbers. We have this, really, really nice garden in the suburbs. And I think I started to really find an appreciation for like the planet and the earth, as cliche as it sounds, like through these very early childhood experiences. And then, in my schooling, I kind of found myself taking environmental science classes in high school, finding them really, really interesting. And then in college, in my undergrad at Syracuse, I, had very, very amazing, unique experiences to work in a plant biology lab where I genetically modified poplar trees to have different genes in them from, it's like very, very sciencey CRISPR, using CRISPR technology to like better understand biofuels and trees and molecular biology. But I also became the president of a club called Students of Sustainability, where we led these school initiatives. We had documentary showings, there were interactions with the famous activist Naomi Klein. And then I also was sitting on it was basically called it was a school committee. So it was like professors, faculty, staff on a sustainability committee for the university. And for a few years, I was like the only student representative. I think they learned, to include and be inclusive of students as the years went on. But I was kind of like the first one who had the opportunity to kind of like see how the university worked and kind of provide the student perspective where relevant in like university decision making. And so I think at Syracuse, it's really where I found my niche in learning more about environmental science, but also like taking on student leadership positions and having like those early leadership moments, which now have, transitioned me into today, like being this urban climate change, leader.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I can see how that story kind of evolved. And it's good that you have, yeah, I mean, that's a neat story that you can pull all the way back to dad and
Yeah.
gardening. And, that's just wonderful. I think that passion that keeps you fueled in your career. So you have two books, right?
I'm not gonna. I have four.
Four.
I
Oh
have,
man,
I
that's a lot.
have,
That's
I have, yeah, yeah. So, I have, I have three published. I
okay.
have another one coming out on Friday, January 30th. And so it's kind of like it's a sequence of books on climate change in cities. And so the assessment that I was alluding to, this climate change in cities assessment that my group called the Urban Climate Change Research Network is leading, is related to, different topics on climate change in cities. And so the first one was related to COVID-19 and lessons learned from the pandemic. And it was actually a really interesting kind of understanding because what we realized as we were doing this research in real time, right? So we were writing the book, we were researching the book during the pandemic, and so it was our it's our first flagship book of the series. And we learned that cities were able to greatly respond in this emergency, this international health emergency.
And this
And
first book's about climate change?
yeah, it's about the interconnection between COVID-19, climate change in cities. And
Okay.
so what we found is that cities were actually really able to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic quite rapidly. And, the question that we brought up is why can't this be also, duplicated for climate? We're in a climate emergency as well. It's a longer term battle. It's not like an acute need, but at the same time, it shows the political will and what was possible like during pandemic times. And there's also like some very, very unique factors of looking at how cities adjusted, the different types of technologies and tools that cities used, including New York. So we also make sure to include New York City relevant research.
So it wasn't necessarily about the science behind climate and COVID. It was more like something happened, a stressful situation that was dire and urgent, and then how does the city address that situation to handle it as quickly as possible to have a positive outcome? And you want to take those learning principles and apply them towards climate.
I think that's a great summary. Yeah, and these assessments, they really do try to incorporate the latest understanding of a particular topic. And so we have the first one on COVID, the second one is on environmental justice, the third is on planning, urban design, and architecture. The fourth one is on finance and climate action. And there's more on governance, nature-based solutions, infrastructure systems. And so these are all books in the series that I've been working on for the last 5 years. And I wouldn't say that they share absolutely everything, but we've definitely critically dived into these or dove into these research topics to not only provide kind of like lessons learned and potential outcomes, but also to in one of our assessments we look at the latest understanding of extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and also sea level rise as well.
Do you do you think, yeah, because I'm getting really interested in what you're talking about. Do you think that there's a way, or do you even have a perspective on I guess how to address it? Because I would think you're up against something. Let's use COVID as an example, or you mentioned financials in the fifth one. Maybe somebody goes through a financial situation. A lot of those are very urgent. They have immediate downsides, and they require cooperation like right now.
Mhm.
Versus the climate cell is way off in the future, and people in general are terrible with patience and
Yeah.
forecasting. So have you begun to just wrap some thought around how do I pull that into the now, make people care more?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really critical point that you're making, right? It's like, how do we make this relevant for everyone or for a lot of people? Or how do we make people care about this, right? And it's not an easy answer. It's not like a one shoe fits everyone's, size thing. So you basically have to tailor, this is the way I approach my work is tailoring the needs of an individual, a group, or a company to the things that are relevant for them, the things that they care about. Um, it's really not an easy answer. I would say that it requires both individualized attention, but also systemic approaches based on like the needs, the vulnerabilities, the different exposures to climate, the interests. But in cities more, more generally in my work, it's saying like so I do some work with the city of Rio de Janeiro, and we have one of our hubs there, and we've done some we call them urban design climate workshops. We've done two in Rio. And so I work very closely with the planning department. Also, we've interacted with Mayor Eduardo Pais and his office, and we've also worked with the technology office down in Rio. And we have local, scientists and expert planners and architects as well. So we work with this giant team, and we say, well, what is your core issue? What are you currently doing, and how can we help you expand your work? And so the city of Rio has developed these really quite amazing corridors. They're called, there's different corridors, and various cities have these, where they have green corridors, which are the nature corridors, the blue ones, which are kind of like the waterways or the coastal, the ways. And then there's also like orange ones that represent the people. And so with these sustainability corridors that Rio has developed, we said, well, how can we better understand your work and, what's really needed in this project next to help you do your job more efficiently or to help, local people better understand and live really like live their lives in a more beneficial, increased livelihood way. And so we worked with them to basically map like localized scenarios of business as usual behaviors. We also looked at enhances in population growth, so increases in what the global population will look like in Rio in 20 to 30 years. And we also looked at a slew of kind of climate factors, so like flooding, for example, heat, air quality. And so we helped them through this process, and it's iterative. We're going back and forth with them and saying, is this useful to you? Can you benefit from this knowledge? How can we work together to actually implement these solutions so that your city is more resilient against climate in the future, but also how can we, increase the livelihoods of the most vulnerable people in your city so that we can overall reduce mortality, reduce, people's you know, acute stresses because of a different climate factor. And so that's kind of one example of how I work with cities to tailor their needs to incorporate kind of where they're at, meet them where they're at and see where we need to go together. But it's definitely not a one size fits all approach. It has to be kind of like developed individually based on the city's needs, their access to data, their resources, their capabilities within their local governance structure. Um, so yeah, it's not like a one-off approach. It's very much one targeting one specific need of that city and saying, how can we help you? If at all, because some cities are completely capable of doing it on their own. New York is a great example of a city that has kind of a robust build out of climate resilience strategies, which I'm happy to talk more about too.
Yeah, I would love to hear New York, and maybe that kind of answers my next question that I was going to go into is, I'm trying to look at this like the city being a business. And from my perspective,
Sure.
what I really do is like I go into underperforming businesses. I either turn them around or I buy them and then flip them later on. Like I'm always looking at like this project.
Hmm.
And the businesses might be different, but there's always just a few things that you can spot from a mile away, and there's always like some core problems you always got to address. And I can always like just spot,
Hmm.
they're making this decision in 6 months, they're going to be here. I know it. And if they fix this, there's those core pieces. Is there any, since you have this global view and you deal with all these cities, are there anything that you're like, look, these are the three things that you just absolutely have to avoid? And we know that this is the biggest driver to be this, kind of like a consultant's perspective.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. It's really nice to hear like kind of how you think about things and how I can potentially apply it into my work. So I think like what I immediately think about in this kind of approach is, and I think there's other people in my field would have different answers, but my kind of core thing is vulnerability reduction. So how can you um, and basically, the cities have different kind of approaches and viewpoints and situations with equity and inequities within their city. And I think the one of the not the telltale signs, but really where you a city really needs to start from in the core heart of the issue, regardless of like climate hazards and how a different city is exposed to different climate factors is like what are your lowest income individuals or groups and how can you uplift them? How can you better their lives? Because they're all at many of these groups have a disproportionate risk level, so they're basically worse off than you and I. They're worse off than middle income, high income groups of people. the way that kind of climate shapes their lives, they feel it a lot more dramatically and drastically and daily than you and I do. So recently, one example that also came up in economics was air quality. And I think it's Kelly who said, there was a study in Harlem, or it was Inwood, I think it was
Yeah.
Inwood, where she said, the air quality is so bad there. And it leads to, comorbidities, high asthma rates, all of these kind of health issues just because of the air quality. And I think if cities were to focus on the needs of the vulnerable, the needs of the low income, to meet them, where they are and to uplift them to the same level of equity that others, naturally or more just inclusively have, the cities would be very much better off because then we wouldn't be responding to emergencies in the same way to say who's this lowest, most vulnerable group. We'd be saying, well, let's get everyone and take care of them all in the same way. But it's not an easy thing to do.
No, it sounds very complicated, and I'm very interested in learning. This is great. So what? All right, so I get it. So if if you're poorer, then you're at a higher risk, and it would affect climate change more. But like, why? What's happening in that population to affect
Hmm.
climate?
Yeah, so I think it's like not it's community specific, right? So different communities have different issues. So for example, let me see. I'll think of a new example. So like Harlem flooding. So because of the geographic the way that like the geography and like the elevation that East Harlem, how the city is kind of shaped. Harlem is more exposed to higher flooding rates. So even during like heavy downpour events, like heavy rainfall events, you'll see flooding in those areas more frequently than, for example, Midtown Manhattan. And our, system approach as a whole is not often, going to Harlem first. It's not saying, well, there was a massive rainfall event. How do we directly respond? The city may or may not go to Harlem first and say, well, how can we help these people? So I think it's a mix of the unique factors in which these communities are placed and marginalized, but then also the way the cities may or may not be responding or caring for these groups of people.
Okay, that is way deeper than what I thought, cool the earth was gonna be. It's such an that's what I appreciate about our community and where we're at so much is expanding the think. I
Mhm.
never would have arrived there. I could have watched a million YouTube videos and never would have arrived at what you just said.
Yeah, but I think that's also, and thank you for that, Mitchell. That's really, it's nice to, to be able to share these topics because it's just so important that people understand, how worse off some people are, and we may not even know. But also, I think of climate when I think of climate change, when I think of the work that I do, when I think of how I lead cities and my imprint on the world, it's not just saying like how can we reduce our fossil fuel emissions? That's so important, but it's like how can we help people, to not die? So it's very much like it's not just a climate, it's not just an environmentalist like me with, a picket in front of DC saying, how can we be better? But it's also saying, like, let's just make sure that everyone has equal access to what they need in their daily lives.
Yeah, that's so I'm jumping back a little bit, but how does all that work and what do you do with NASA? Because
Mm,
when you and I had a conversation over lunch at Residence Week,
yes.
and I'm like, all I knew about NASA was the space program that they sent you to when you were a kid in elementary school.
Yeah.
But what are they doing now?
Yeah, so there's different divisions of NASA. I work in the NASA Earth Science division. And so when you think of NASA, we all think about space exploration. We think about satellites. We think about, aliens and all these things. But I think NASA is, we do a lot. And this includes the Earth Science Division, which looks at and deploys satellites that point down at Earth. And so we're not only exploring, outer space and space and different planets, but we're also exploring and understanding and learning and collecting data on our own planet. And so my work with NASA focuses on using the data pointed down at Earth to say, well, what is this land coverage? Or, what are these heat sensors telling us? And so I use satellite data to better understand and incorporate, climate solutions into policy. So I use the data and then say, well, here's how it's relevant to policy. So there's a lot of steps in between, but I think that's the gist of it, that we use satellite data to make it stakeholder relevant.
That's cool. What have you worked with any big fancy people as far as policy goes?
Have I worked with any big fancy people? I mean, I did mention Eduardo País, who is the
Yeah.
mayor of Rio. We do work with, different city offices in, various countries. But have I really met anyone that famous? I mean, I know that like John Kerry was at one of I go to the conference of the parties, it's the big UN climate conference every year. And John Kerry was at them once, and so I feel like I'm in neighboring rooms to all of these,
Okay.
big fancy people. I was very fortunate on one of the recent, we call them COPs, the Conference of the Parties events. I was on this official side event panel with some very high level people from the World Bank and from different developing countries, representing like financial ministries and things like that. So I wouldn't say I've met anyone like super famous, but at the same time, I'm definitely like in the neighboring room of these people.
Hey, that's get closer to power. And that's what you're doing. That's awesome. That'll open up a bunch of doors. I don't want to leave the New York thing that you brought up when we talked
Sure.
about that. Because this is my interaction with New York. I love Manhattan. And I
Mhm.
love it for a bunch of different reasons. But I don't know what the answers are. Maybe you can expose me to what these answers are. But when I look at how Atlanta operates and a lot of
Mm.
other cities that I go to versus New York, it's meaningfully different. I'll give you a couple examples. So, like me and my wife had to go to an appointment this morning, and we were 15 minutes late to the appointment because there was literally nowhere to park all through the city.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not uncommon. So like Atlanta has gotten so popular that they build all these little like towns that you can like live in and like everybody loves doing that.
Hmm.
But they're so full of people, it's inoperable. It's bumper to bumper traffic
Mm.
everywhere you go. I know we talked about in our econ class about how the speed of traffic is slowed down from 19 to 7 in Manhattan. It's like zero in
Yeah.
Atlanta. I mean, it's terrible. Infrastructure is terrible. They put no money into it. So there's like no extra roads. There's no whatever. You can't get anywhere. There's no public transportation. It's 900 degrees all year round.
Mm.
Like it's just, I look at this place and I'm like, nobody's investing in the infrastructure to
Yeah.
run this thing. But I go to Manhattan and I have an apartment right across the street from school, like on 126th. But I go downtown all the time. I can beat an Uber every single time. I don't even take Ubers because I can beat it on the subway.
Right.
And it's like I get there's a lot of people, but it moves so well. The infrastructure
Mhm.
is outstanding. I understand it might smell a little bit or whatever, but it looks I've never lived there like 100%, but as a unit, I'm so impressed by how that sucker moves because when I
Yes.
go home, I'm like this is terrible. Like this sucks. We got to get out of here.
Yeah, I think thank you for providing that because I actually haven't I've been to Atlanta once, but it wasn't, I think you have much more you painted like a much clearer picture of like the difference of the two cities. And I think like, I'm not in an expert in the cross comparison between Atlanta and New York, but at the same time, it seems to me like the way the cities were formed were two different kind of ways. And so, like the way that we densify our urban population and the way we like sprawl out to expand beyond the density could definitely be what some of the issues that Atlanta might be facing is, as the city sprawls or as the population kind of like leaves from the core and spreads out, there might not be this, the infrastructure to support this kind of like the urban sprawl, like the spreading out of the city, which I think could be leading to some of the function issues that you're facing. New York is in like a different kind of scenario where we've, built out our infrastructure hundreds of years ago, and now all of it's like aging and falling apart. And so New York is like desperately trying to keep up with like the way that we built the city, hundreds of years ago. And so sometimes like the L line, the L subway line will be down, for example, and like it will only run every 20 minutes. Or, sometimes you'll have like these critical infrastructure challenges where the subway lines aren't working and, there's flooding in one of them and maybe like there's sinkholes popping up or there's like coastal flooding issues. And I think it's like a factor of our, aging infrastructure. And so New York has its like own unique issues and challenges that it's working through every single day. I will say that New York is heavily prepared and investing for climate emergencies and climate disasters. New York has something called the New York Panel on Climate Change, which is an independent advisory board that provides the latest climate science and then, kind of translates or begins to piece together how the climate science and data affect New York. And so they produce these independent reports, I want to say every like 3 to 5 years. And the city, it's a local law, so the city has to like incorporate some of this, the science into their policies and decision making, which I think is an extraordinarily unique thing about New York, where they're saying we understand, the science is so critically important, and we're actively bringing this into our implementation of climate solutions. And so there's, various physical infrastructure projects throughout the city. The southern tip of Manhattan, for example. I don't know if you've been to Little Island. It's
I have
near
not.
like Chelsea. It's this really, really cute little island, basically, where they've built kind of like a coastal resilience slash like community engagement space where you can go and listen to opera, for example, but they also like have planted trees and like, local vegetation, but it also serves as like a physical coastal barrier against storms. And so the city is like actively investing, like heavily investing in these types of physical infrastructure solutions that help prepare them for another Hurricane Sandy type event, but also considering like how hot is it getting? How hot is it, in the summers? Like if there's 5 days of heat, how are we preparing? And so sometimes, often you'll see that like I don't know if you spent a summer in New York yet, but
The last one. Yeah, I was there a
yeah,
lot.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, but sometimes you'll see like the fire hydrants are opened and like spewing out water. This is purposeful. So the city is like actively choosing to open up the water in that location to provide people with like instant cooling measures. And so like the city is, targeting these very hyper specific localized solutions to not only meet the needs of, high income individuals in Manhattan, but also considering lower income individuals in Harlem, in Brooklyn, in Queens, for example. I'm not saying that the city is perfect. I think there's a lot of opportunities for growth, but at the same time, I am so pleased that we live in a city like New York, or at least are studying and going to school in a city like New York, because we are much more resilient to climate related issues and different things that could also be an emergency, but not necessarily our climate, right? Like, so there's this one thing that I focus on in my work, and they're called compound risks or compound hazards. And so it's basically like two events happening at once. And so it could be something that's like naturally occurring, meeting a climate thing. Um, but but really what I'm trying to say is that the city isn't just preparing for these like one-off climate events, but it's also like these non-climate planning and response initiatives as well.
That's really great to hear all that they're doing all the forward thinking because I agree.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their problems. I was talking to somebody the other day, New York's got plenty of problems, but also Georgia, Marietta and Douglas County, which is where I grew up, it's the meth capital of the United States.
Mm,
And Macon, Georgia, definitely in the southeast, but it might be nationally as the murder capital. So I'm
mm,
like, look, we all got our problems. We're all a little crazy, so,
yeah.
but I just really appreciate hearing that New York is doing all the forward thinking. So, you know, you sound like I mean, you're crushing it. You got these books, you got it all together, you got all this think. I mean, it's wonderful. And then you're getting this MBA. Where's Maria going? I mean,
Yeah.
what are you shooting for?
Yeah, so I think like the reason why I came to business, I think I have plenty of reasons why I came to business school, but um, I was a short-term consultant with the World Bank for about, funny enough, it wasn't that short, it was about 2 years. And in that project, I provided a case study on New York and worked with other specialists and other scientists developing other case studies in cities. And through this kind of like banking experience, I was fortunate enough to go to Beijing and share the findings with different city officials in Beijing. And it was really, really unique experience for me. And I think it kind of shaped where my head's at now, where it's like, well, what are the economic benefits of climate change and or like climate solutions, and how can we, reduce the financial burdens related to climate disasters? And so I think like the connection between economics and climate are really what sparked my interest and which led me into the executive MBA at Columbia Business School. And now I'm saying, well, what do I do next? How do I take these passions and what I've learned into, my next steps or my next stages in life, which is exciting and daunting at the same time, right? Like, what are we doing when we graduate? I feel so fortunate to continue to build out the Urban Climate Change Research Network to bring all of the knowledge that I've learned in business school into the network and into its 2,000 members and 15 research hubs. So I intend to continue to kind of incorporate the knowledge and what I've learned through the program to benefit not just the network, but also to our assessments, our workshops, our databases of case studies. And then I think in the longer term, I see myself moving from this like science advisory position to more of like being the implementer. So I think what's next for me is kind of saying, well, how do I become the implementer of these climate solutions? How do I lead on climate impacts and really kind of like shape the world that I want that I want to live in, that I want my family to be able to live in. So I think my next steps will be, potentially going over to the private sector, and I hope we can reflect on this in a few years and I've accomplished this. But I'm hoping to go into the private sector and start to work with kind of a chief sustainability officer team and really kind of like shape the sustainability and climate solution based business practices in a private sector setting. So I really do think there is extreme value there, and there's so much potential for like good and positive impact if handled and done right.
Man, yeah, I have no doubt you're gonna crush it. I mean, you're already years ahead. So I'm gonna put your link to your books in the show notes. Where can people get it? They get it on Amazon? You got a website or?
Yes, so thank you for that. It's all free to download. That's how
Oh,
academia does it. So you don't have to pay for any of these books. They're free to download the full PDF on Cambridge University Press's Elements website.
oh, great. Awesome. Well, I'll get the link from you. And then whether it's on YouTube or Spotify, you can just check the show notes and they'll be in there. That's awesome. They're free. Let's go.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, that's the way we do it in academia. Everything's accessible for everyone.
Good. Hey, well, thank you so much for coming on, Maria.
Thank you so much, Mitchell.